John Hall is the Ambrose Heseltine Associate Professor of U.S. Military History at UW-Madison. He holds a BS in History from the U.S. Military Academy at West Point and a PhD in History from the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. He specializes in early American military history with a particular emphasis on partisan and Native American warfare. The Black Hawk War. Outside of Wisconsin, the Black Hawk War is the best known the conflict in which Abraham Lincoln earned his limited military experience. Within Wisconsin, it is somewhat better known, if only because its namesake and his Sauk tribe are memorialized by parks, towns, inns, and roads throughout the state. But what was the war actually over? And what did it mean? Professor John Hall explores the colonial roots of a war far more significant than most realize, one that settled at least a 200-year contest for control of the region by great powers, both Indian and European. I give to you Dr. John Hall. Welcome.
Thank you, Vicki, for the invitation. Thanks for that lovely introduction, and thank you also for the warm welcome. It is a great pleasure to be with everybody this morning. So what do you really know about Black Hawk War? I'm assuming that most of the people in the auditorium this morning are longtime Wisconsin residents, if not natives, and you know at least something about this war. But what about people that aren't from Wisconsin? What do they know about the Black Hawk War? Well, if they come from a military background, like I do, they no doubt associate the war with one of its namesakes, the UH-60 helicopter, which has become ubiquitous over the past 20 years or so. That's the Black Hawk. Most military helicopters are named after Indian tribes. This is actually a notable exception in that it's named after an Indian individual instead of a tribe. That Huey helicopter that was so ubiquitous in Vietnam is always called a Huey, but its actual Indian moniker is UH-1 Iroquois. But all of the helicopters have an Indian name. So this is maybe one of the most famous, at least in contemporary times. If you're a hockey fan, also like me, you no doubt also associate the Black Hawk War with one of the NHL's signature franchises, the Chicago Blackhawks. Now, if you are a Wisconsin native, like me, and I suspect most of you, you will also associate it with countless businesses between here and the Quad Cities, not to mention the towns, parks, roads, etc., that Vicki mentioned. I think perhaps as a small child, I at one time stayed at the Black Hawk Motel in Wisconsin Dells. But if you are a student of this period of history, who actually has read something on this conflict or visited the historical sites along the campaign trail, you are also likely aware, also as Vicki had mentioned, that this is the conflict in which Abraham Lincoln gained his very limited military experience as a captain and later as a private of Illinois Volunteers. But what else do you know? What else do you really know, and what else do Americans really know about the most significant conflict of the historical era to be waged within the boundaries of what we now call Wisconsin? What was this war really over, and what did it mean for the inhabitants of this region then and subsequently? It's my privilege to answer those questions for you this morning, and I'll begin by telling you why anyone, citizen of Wisconsin or otherwise, should care about the Black Hawk War. First, also, as Vicki mentioned in the introduction, it ended a 200-year struggle for control of the upper Mississippi Valley by great powers and Indian powers, often allied against one another and also, of course, naturally allied against one another as well. Second, this conflict is fairly typical of America's wars of continental colonization during the 19th century. Note, I'm not talking about the colonial era, that era in which we usually think ends with the American Revolution. Rather, I'm talking about the period in which the United States itself becomes a colonial power and extends itself in increments and extends its dominion over the continent in increments over not only the continent but also the indigenous peoples who reside there. In this regard, the United States exercises what I would call sort of a hybrid form of colonialism. People who are really into the study of colonialism will sometimes distinguish the United States as being a settler colony or exercising settler imperialism in which there is no formal metropolitan empire, the style that the French or the British or other European great powers will use in their colonization efforts, and they distinguish that by saying that the real responsibility, the agency here is on the settlers themselves. But as we'll see in today's talk, I think that depiction is a bit overblown. People will say the United States is not an empire because it never has a colonial office. It does, in fact, have a colonial office. It is called the Indian Office, and it resides inside, first the War Department, and later inside the Department of the Interior. The responsibilities of that Indian Office align perfectly with any other colonial office that you might read about in a European context. So what we have here is a hybrid form of colonization, and this war in the 19th century is typical of the way in which the United States, a metropolitan power in the government and settler agency in terms of the population on the frontier and their local elected officials, work sometimes at odds with one another, but ultimately in concert with one another to complete the colonization of what we today call the United States. This hybrid organization and the tension between these two, the metropole, if you will, the federal government that sees itself as a balancing force that's supposed to look after all of the inhabitants of the lands that it claims, the Indians and the white citizens of the United States, and then the settlers themselves who care very little for the Indian rights and are often begrudging that the federal government cares about upholding the letter of the law rather than just getting the Indians out of the way for them. This tension is also reflected in the military organization that wages this war on behalf of the United States. Regulars of the U.S. Army augmented by volunteers, principally from the state of Illinois, but also some come from the state of Indiana and from Michigan Territory. But in this regard, Michigan Territory is what we today call Wisconsin. It's that western part of Michigan Territory. The volunteers were nominally under the command of U.S. Army regulars, but as we'll see, not always very effectively. And finally, for those who read history with an eye to contemporary events, the practical, ethical, and moral challenges of this colonial war bear striking similarities to those the United States has faced in the 21st century and is likely to continue to face in the years ahead. One of the ways in which this war is similar is that it wasn't really a single war, but rather the intersection of conflicts that predated the interjection of colonial power with that own colonial power's war of conquest. Thus, while most accounts of the Black Hawk War begin in 1804, when future President William Henry Harrison fleeced the Sauk and Meskwaki Indians of a huge swath of land, mostly in what is Illinois, we're going to go back a little bit further to explore the colonial roots of this conflict. But I'll move rather briskly and get into some of the parts of the war with which we're probably more familiar and also a little more interested. But if you'll bear with me for a moment, we're going to go all the way back to the so-called Beaver Wars of the 17th century, especially of the 1640s through the 1660s. The Beaver Wars are wars of expansion by the Iroquois Confederacy of New York. Now, I apologize for the low resolution of this map. It's the best that I could do, but I'll kind of orient you here. You could probably recognize right here Long Island, and you can recognize right there Cape Cod. And so here are the Great Lakes. So this right here is what is today the state of New York, which is the Iroquois homeland. The Iroquois enjoy some advantages in terms of geographic proximity and isolation at the same time. They're close to European trading powers, yet they're far enough removed from them that they can call the shots of their own relationship with European powers. And they very early on enjoy an advantageous position when it comes to the global fur trade. They get their hands on guns earlier, are economically integrated into the global fur trade earlier. They hunt out all of the beaver which reside on their own lands, which live on their own lands very early on, which then in turn encourages them, in fact compels them to have to wage wars of westward and northward expansion in order to get more beaver pelts to feed this fur trade. Now that they have become a fairly martial society, to provide their young men with opportunities to win martial glory and distinction in society. And as they lose those young men, they will also wage these wars to replace them with captives. So on this map, these deep red, maroon, thin arrows represent Iroquois offensives against their Indian neighbors. The fat orange and olive arrows, meanwhile, represent the displacements, the huge refugee crises created by these Iroquois offensives. Now, looking at the map after I've oriented you, can anybody figure out where a great many of these refugees end up settling, marked here by this yellow goose egg, as we would say in the Army? That is, I'm hearing what are no doubt a multitude of correct answers out there. That is Lake Winnebago in the middle of that, and this is the Fox River Valley. And that is where a great many of these refugees, pushed westward by the Iroquois, come to settle. Here in the Wisconsin country, the indigenous tribes, in this case the Menominees and the Ho-Chunks, were at first gracious hosts, but they found themselves outnumbered on their own land, which couldn't support such a large population. So what you have here are the broken pieces, in some instances, of a lot of displaced Indian communities. Tribe is more of an ethnic designation than a political one, certainly, in this era. And one historian, Richard White, has described this as a shatter zone, in which these pieces all settle, and the people who actually live here find themselves hard-pressed as well. How do they put themselves back together? They have mutual need. They have mutual enemies, and they have, in the French, a would-be European great power that finds itself at a disadvantage vis-a-vis the British because it does not have the same kind of trade network that the British have at this time. It does not have the Indian allies. And most importantly, the French are disadvantaged because they don't have a large settler population, which prevents them from establishing a very strong economic base. And so, whereas the British need the Indians more or less to get out of the way to make room for English settlers, the French need these Indians as trading partners for the fur trade and as Indian warriors. The Indians, meanwhile, need a supply of guns and they need a place to sell the furs. This mutual dependency, they are genuinely dependent upon one another, makes it impossible for one side to really take advantage of or exploit the other, and it creates a remarkable Indian alliance built on what the great historian Richard White has called the middle ground. And the middle ground is referring to both this place geographically, as well as metaphorically this kind of zone of accommodation that the French reach with these Indian allies. And it is really remarkable. Now, not everybody gets along inside of this alliance. The Meskwaki Indians, who you probably better know as the Fox, had been driven out of the Michigan Peninsula by their own Indian enemies, the Ojibwa or Chippewa, and moved into Wisconsin, where they proceeded to make a nuisance of themselves. They didn't get along with the Indians who were native to Wisconsin. They moved further west. They made enemies of the Dakota Sioux there. They moved back to Michigan, made enemies with everybody that was living around Detroit, until finally the French and their Indian alliance had had enough of the Fox and waged very nearly genocidal wars against them from 1712 until 1737, during which the Meskwakis, or Fox, become close allies to the Saukes. And this is going to form a confederacy, an alliance that will eventually turn into a confederacy, and eventually, by this day and age, will lead to a political union so that there's a federally recognized Sauk and Fox tribe. But at this point, they are simply military allies. And by the 1730s, they're going to be pushed southwestward through Wisconsin by the French and their Indian allies, ultimately into Iowa, where they proceed to make even more Indian enemies with their neighbors there. Indeed, the entire region was in a state of perpetual, if low-level conflict between various and partially overlapping Indian alliances. White observers usually referred to these animosities as ancient, and some of them were, but a great many of them were in fact a consequence of European imperial struggles over North America. The most important Indian contest, as it pertains to the eventual Black Hawk War, was this. The Dakota Sioux and their Menominee allies hated the Sauks and Meskwakis, and vice versa. Meanwhile, the Ho-Chunks, or Winnebagos, followed local allegiances on the basis of marriage, kinship ties, and where they lived. So the Ho-Chunks or Winnebagos are all over the state of what will become the state of Wisconsin, and it really depends upon where they live and who their relatives are. And so they're kind of in the middle, some are on one side or the other, and a great many are more or less neutral. These animosities, these intra-Indian conflicts, did not prevent most of these Indian tribes from allying with Great Britain during the War of 1812. The most ardent British allies were the Sauks, and among the most inveterate foes of the United States was a war leader among them named Black Hawk. He was therefore understandably disappointed when, after having fought the Americans to a draw during the War of 1812, the British summarily abandoned the Old Northwest, this part of the country, and the Indians who lived there to the tender mercies of the United States. Nor was Black Hawk won over by the United States' offering of treaties of peace and friendship among the region's tribes after the war, because even as it's holding out these treaties of peace and friendship, it's building military fortifications across Indian lands in this part of the country. But most of the other Indians, including those who are having forts built on their lands, are willing to listen, because the Americans, in critical regards, are offering to replace the French and the British after them in those crucial roles as trading partners and as military allies. They are sending the Indians, beginning in 1815, 1816, signals that they too understand the middle ground, and they want to build an alliance upon it. Most important here is probably economic integration, because the Indians are now engaged in a global economy, and if they don't have somebody to sell furs to, their economy is in trouble. This is encouraged also by the way in which the U.S. Army and the Indian agents of the Indian Office conduct diplomacy with the Indians. They adhere to those same protocols that had been used previously by the British and the French. And then once they're established in the region, a lot of those Indian agents and the officers at those military posts do as the British and French had done before them, and they take Indian wives for themselves. The issue from those relationships, the children of American officials and Indian women, provide the most enduring bonds of alliance in the minds of most Indian people, for whom the bonds of kinship are stronger than anything else. American officials also in these early years go out of their way to make sure that the Indians feel that the law of the United States protects them and does not disadvantage them vis-a-vis the Americans. Now, this is during a period of what I would call, in fact, martial law on the frontier, where the Army calls more of the shots than do territorial officials. And as soon as the territorial officials obtain more of the power and the Army moves further west, this changes dramatically. But so long as the frontier is under a version of martial law, the Indians receive signals that the Americans are honest brokers. There's a case in Green Bay in which a drunken soldier grabbed the notable Menominee chief Pogana, he didn't grab him, rather he stabbed him in the thigh with a bayonet. Pogana, obviously not real pleased by this turn of events, grabs the soldier by the throat, throws him to the ground, curses him as a dog, and says if he was not an American soldier, he would kill him right then and there. Now, how do you suppose the commander of Fort Howard responded to this news? You might be surprised. He had the soldier whipped in a public square for all the Indians to see. So the Indians could understand and respect, we won't tolerate this kind of behavior from our people toward your venerated leaders. All of these things suggested continuity to most of the Indians who lived in this region. In their experience and in the first decade of American occupation, little suggested to them that the Great Father, as they called the president, reserved special treatment for his white children. But there were some alarming departures from the earlier practices of the British and French. One was what we would today call peace enforcement, and another what was then called the civilization program. The civilization program essentially is intended to transform the Indians from agriculturalists who also get a great deal of their protein from hunting into small plot yeoman farmers who give up hunting, more or less, and live more or less just like the Yankee settlers who are flowing westward. Why would the federal government care about this? Well, part of it is a genuine paternalistic, ethnocentric conceit that they're living that Americans know how to live and the Indians are backward, and we have sort of a white man's burden to uplift them. But there's also an economic motive for this. Hunting takes a lot of land. Small plot agriculture takes less land. If you can turn them into small plot farmers, they don't need all of this land, and they can sell their so-called surplus land to the government, which can then sell it to white settlers in the region. Now, taken together, these two things, peace enforcement and civilization, amount to what we would today call nation building. And it was no easier then than it is today. No matter the time or the place, people just seem to be less than fond of foreigners coming onto their lands and telling them how backward they are and how much better their lives are going to be if they can learn to live like that foreign occupier. They're even less fond of this when those same foreigners are also intent on taking away the indigenous population's land and sovereignty. Even before it was clear to the Indians that this was, in fact, the United States' ultimate objective, American colonial officials, those agents of the Indian office, were very explicit that the Indians were to stop making war against one another and give up hunting for farming. This is a big, big cultural problem in this region because in these relatively flat Indian societies, there aren't engineers, there aren't a lot of ways in which you can distinguish yourself professionally in life. The way in which the overwhelming majority of young Indian men will make a name for themselves, will achieve status within their society, is by excellence in war and excellence in hunting. And now the government of the United States is coming and saying, no more war and no more hunting. For you to progress in our mind, you must become women. And needless to say, that does not go over very well with the indigenous inhabitants. Complicating matters even further, white lead miners began flooding the region in the late 1820s, abusing native populations. I think I've got this upside down and went the wrong way. Abusing the native populations and provoking a war with the Ho-Chunks in 1827. The following year, these miners and men like them elected Andrew Jackson to the presidency, with doleful consequences for the security of the upper Mississippi River Valley. Now, as I mentioned, the Indian agents to this point had been more or less, at least in their own minds, honest brokers of metropolitan control. They are haughty, they're arrogant, they do think they know better than the Indians. They think the Indians are essentially intellectually children, and their lives will be better if they do what the government tells them. But there is some sincerity in this belief, and they also become oftentimes very loyal to the Indian peoples that they work with. A great many of them, as I said, take wives amongst these same communities, and others have longstanding economic relationships, and the Indians come to regard their Indian agents, not always, but not infrequently either, as the American that they can trust or depend upon. But Jackson didn't care for this. I mean, this to him looks like divided loyalty. Moreover, after being elected president, Jackson's got patronage he needs to dispense. He needs to pay off friends and people who helped him get elected. And what better way to do that than to get rid of all these Indian lovers in the Indian office and replace them with his own cronies? And so that's what he does. And so by September of 1831, Jackson replaced fully half of his 56 Indian agents and sub-agents with unqualified party hacks. It's perhaps not surprising then that Indian relations took a marked turn for the worse in 1830 and 1831 as intertribal violence escalated. In May of 1830, 50 Dakotas and Menominees killed 16 Meskwaki Indians. The following summer in July, the Meskwakis retaliated by killing 25 Menominees. Each side thinks it's evening the score. The other side disagrees, and the Menominees start plotting their own retaliation during the winter of 1831 and 1832. Most people aren't aware that it is this that leads the U.S. Army to deploy up the Mississippi River from Jefferson Barracks, Missouri. The Army gets those orders before Black Hawk crosses the Mississippi into Illinois in 1832. The Army gets those deployment orders for peace enforcement, to move up the Mississippi and to prevent the Menominees and Dakotas from going to war against the Sacs and Meskwakis. So, hoping to prevent the eruption of a general Indian war, the War Department issues those orders to Atkinson on 17 March 1832. One of the things that is also on his list of tasks is to apprehend the Meskwakis who were responsible for that last batch of murders in the summer of 1831. And those murderers, 50 to 60 of them, have now taken refuge with the band of that Sauk war captain, Black Hawk. Now, Black Hawk by this time had already become a person of interest. And as I said earlier, most accounts of this war begin in 1804 with this treaty that takes away all of that land from the Sacs and Meskwakis for the paltry sum of $1,000 a year. The Indians were almost certainly fleeced in this, and all of the envoys that were present at that treaty signing said that was not their intent. They didn't understand that they were signing that over. And over the years, the Sacs and Meskwakis protested the legitimacy of this treaty, but eventually, after the War of 1812, they conceded that they were going to abide by it, even though they didn't think it was fair or just. Most of them said that they were going to abide by them. Those that were going to abide by this treaty followed the so-called peace chief Keokuk. Those who wanted not to abide by this treaty generally aligned themselves with the British band of Black Hawk. It was called the British band because of their alliance to the British during the War of 1812, because they continued to fly a Union Jack over their camp, and most likely because they also hoped that the British still in Canada would come to their rescue if it came to another war against the United States. So Black Hawk, by this time, is known to the American officials as a troublemaker, as a malcontent, as a militant. And he flaunts American authority by, in 1831, crossing the Mississippi River from Iowa over to the ancestral Sauk village of Saukenok in order to plant a summer crop. This is a provocative but peaceful movement. He's maintaining their traditional migration patterns, but he's doing so against the stated will of the United States. This leads to the calling up of Illinois volunteers, regular Army units deploy. Hostilities are averted, however, because the senior Army commander in the West, General Edmund Gaines, knows better than to invite an Indian war, and he knows that diplomacy is the right way to solve this. And he gets Black Hawk to retire back to Iowa in 1831. Black Hawk, however, is not done trying this routine. Perhaps, as I said earlier, anticipating support from Great Britain, and certainly anticipating the support of most of the Indian tribes that live in Illinois and southern Wisconsin, Black Hawk and approximately 1,000 followers crossed the Mississippi again in April of 1832. Now, once he does this, this complicates General Henry Atkinson's mission tremendously, because in addition to preventing this intertribal Indian war, apprehending the Meskwaki killers, he now has to deal with the more pressing matter of getting Black Hawk to return to Iowa before it throws the entire region into a panic. He hopes to accomplish this peacefully, but he makes one hugely crucial mistake when he encouraged the Illinois governor, John Reynolds, to call up that state's militia. Up for re-election, John Reynolds not only did this, but he whipped the entire state into a panic by depicting Black Hawk's movements as an invasion. This had tragic consequences for a couple of reasons. First, Anglo-Americans living in the frontier regions were prone to panic at the slightest rumor of Indian violence, prone themselves, the Anglo-American settlers that is, to violent indiscriminate overreaction. Second, in this era, any man who aspired to political office in a frontier state or territory improved his prospects tremendously if he could establish his bona fides as an Indian fighter. So you've got these two things, fear and ambition, that are both operating when they depict this as an invasion and then call up the militia or call for volunteers. Notwithstanding the U.S. government's insistence that the Indians give up their own dreams of martial glory, young Anglo-American men were also inclined to make a name for themselves by exploits in war. So it's not surprising that perhaps 5% of Illinois' male population took up arms as volunteers. Yet they, like the vast majority of volunteers, were hardly renowned for their discipline. The satirical sketch here, I suppose I didn't point it out, most of you could probably recognize that's supposed to be Abraham Lincoln. But if you've been looking closely at the rest of this, you will notice this doesn't quite look like the citizen soldier of American lore. Who are these guys? And why are there people dressed like the devil and buccaneers and somebody from A Midsummer Night's Dream back here at the end of this formation? What is with these uniforms they are wearing? This is actually a sketch of the New York Fantasticals on parade in New York City in 1831. They are lampooning their own military unpreparedness in an era in which state militia regulations still mandated universal military service. If you were a male between the ages of, it varied state by state, but roughly 18 and 45, you needed to own an operating musket and you needed to turn out for monthly drill. Now, as the frontier moves west, the need for this becomes even more remote. And so these guys are just making fun of all of this by turning out for drill and turning it into this kind of charade. That's all well and good for New York City in the 1830s, you might say. But what about in a genuine frontier state such as Illinois, where they do in fact live in a state of constant paranoia about the prospect of Indian hostilities? You may be surprised to learn that even on the frontier these kind of things occurred. In fact, Abraham Lincoln himself observed a similar scene in Springfield, where he saw a parade that was headed by a friend on horseback who carried a wooden sword 9 feet in length and wore a pasteboard cocked hat as big as an ox yoke. They bore banners inscribed with facetious mottos such as, "We'll fight till we run, and we'll run till we die." Others in Springfield created facetious militia regulations. No man is to wear more than 5 pounds of codfish for epaulets, or more than 30 yards of bologna sausages for a sash. And no two men are to dress alike, and if any two should dress alike, the one that dressed most alike is to be fined. This is the state of the militia volunteers when it comes to military discipline. But that's never been the forte of the militiamen or the volunteers. Now, among them is Lincoln himself, who was then a 23-year-old store clerk from New Salem, Illinois. And he volunteered for the Black Hawk War as a means of advancing his own political ambitions. He was rather gangly and bookish compared to most of the other volunteers, but he was also incredibly strong, which proved sufficient to win him election as captain of his volunteer company. This was Lincoln's first electoral success in his entire career and his first leadership opportunity. Reflecting on the victory in his 1860 presidential campaign biography, Lincoln claimed in the third person, "He has not since had any success in life which gave him so much satisfaction as winning that election as company commander." But while Lincoln was looking for elected office, many of the men he commanded were instead looking for blood. The previous summer, Edmund Gaines's diplomacy, timely, we would say in hindsight, disappointed them. They mocked General Gaines and the regular army as not having a stomach for war, and they called that a corn war, because instead of ending in a hail of bullets, it ended with the U.S. Army giving Black Hawk's followers a bunch of corn as sort of a bribe to peaceably go back into Iowa. They did not want that outcome again because they were not going to make a name for themselves in their own society by simply standing around while another army general came in and conducted diplomacy. This time in 1832, they would not be denied a fight. They accomplished their aim, although not probably in the manner in which they would have preferred. Excuse me. It was a brief engagement that took place on May 14, 1832, and it seemed to vindicate one army officer's description of the militia as that prosopopoeia of weakness, waste, and confusion. Riding ahead of Atkinson's regulars, a militia cavalry squadron under Major Isaiah Stillman refused to acknowledge a white flag of truce carried by a delegation of Black Hawk, who by this time had decided to return to Iowa peacefully again. Instead, the militiamen fired upon and seized Black Hawk's envoys, inviting retaliation. In the ensuing rout, Stillman lost 11 troopers, while Black Hawk lost only 3. Having thus started the war Atkinson was supposed to prevent, the Illinois militiamen lost their nerve, and most refused to re-enlist upon the expiration of their 30-day enlistments. Not so with Lincoln, who was still running for public office and needed to pad his Indian fighting credentials as much as possible, so he stayed on in that second force, this time as a lowly private. Atkinson, meanwhile, called for federal reinforcements, and Illinois Governor John Reynolds began to assemble a second, hopefully more stalwart volunteer force. While waiting for these forces to come into the field, however, Atkinson on May 26, 1832, made the very unorthodox decision to enlist aid from other Indians, ultimately accepting the services of more than 700 Dakotas, Menominees, Ho-Chunks, and Potawatomis. Justifying his decision to his superiors after the fact, Atkinson explained to the commanding general that such allies were very necessary in such a warfare as I am engaged. This was unorthodox because it was contrary to national policy at the time. We're supposed to be weaning the Indians from intertribal warfare, not encouraging them and licensing them to wage it. Most of the Indian agents in the region opposed the decision because it ran counter to the civilization program in the same regard. We're telling them to lay down the tomahawks and pick up the plow, and here you are encouraging them to do exactly the opposite. Frontier whites were almost wholly opposed to the move because it suggested weakness on the part of the United States, on the part of the settler communities on the frontier, and because it suggested that Indians were somehow the equals of whites, that they're allies. If you're an ally of mine, that means you're an equal, and that's a message that most of the frontier settlers were very uncomfortable with at the time. Many of Atkinson's regular army officers were skeptical, but they were willing to go along with it, at least until they began to suspect that not all of the Indians were honestly and legitimately trying to help them and the United States. There was some merit to their suspicions. Those who were most eager to fight, those who actually had a stake in this fight, were the Dakotas and the Menominees, a sizable contingent. The problem was their services were squandered by ham-handed efforts by Atkinson and his subordinates to try to command them in the field rather than to just let them lead themselves. And so those who really wanted in this fight, those who Atkinson had originally been sent to keep out of it, remained out of it largely because of the inadvertent intercession of Atkinson himself and his subordinates. The other groups, though, were not necessarily wholly in the Americans' camp in this regard. The Ho-Chunks, as I said earlier, they've got loyalties all over the place, and they will do throughout this conflict what they feel is in the best interests of their communities. Sometimes this is helping the Americans, sometimes this is helping Black Hawk, sometimes it is doing the exact same thing at the exact same time. And that's the course that most of the Ho-Chunks follow during the Black Hawk War. The Potawatomis, meanwhile, very sympathetic to Black Hawk, but recognize that there are rumors about that they are in league with him. And so they manufacture a demonstration of loyalty and allegiance to the United States. They put together a 95 man contingent, and they go out to offer to guide Atkinson's army through northern Illinois and into southeastern Wisconsin to help them find Black Hawk's band after that disaster at Stillman's Run. Now, they do this for 2 months. Potawatomi guides are leading Atkinson's army for 2 months in their own backyard, and Atkinson's army never once makes contact with the British band. Now, there are 2 explanations to this. One, the Potawatomis don't know their own backyard, or 2, the Potawatomis don't actually want Atkinson to find Black Hawk's followers. I'll let you be the judge as to which of these is the more likely. Yet, in the end, the Americans would not have rediscovered Black Hawk's trail were it not for the contributions of the Ho-Chunks, some of whom regarded Black Hawk as their enemy, many more of whom hoped that their post-war interests would be served best by demonstrating loyalty to the Americans. So, led by Ho-Chunk guides, volunteer forces under Colonel Henry Dodge and Brigadier General James Henry discovered Black Hawk's trail and gave chase, resulting in the only engagement of the war that deserves the designation battle. Abandoned by his rear guard with most of his warriors, Black Hawk personally led 120 warriors in a delaying action against 750 volunteers on the bluffs overlooking the Wisconsin River near present-day Sauk City. Black Hawk lost over half of his force, but bought time for his non-combatants to make good their escape across and down the Wisconsin River. While the battle made a hero out of Henry Dodge, one Army lieutenant recognized that Black Hawk had, in fact, accomplished the most difficult of military operations, to wit, the passage of a river in the presence, no less, of 3 regiments of American volunteers. But the respite for Black Hawk's followers was temporary, for the Americans could also cross the Wisconsin and were themselves unencumbered by children and invalids. Moreover, the Americans and their Indian allies lay in wait at the mouth of the Wisconsin while patrolling further up the Mississippi with the steamboat Warrior, which, on the afternoon of August 1st, discovered the bulk of the British band trying to cross near the mouth of the Bad Axe River. Although the Indians raised a white flag, the officers aboard suspected a ruse, so they discharged 3 bursts of canister into the desperate Indians. The ensuing firefight petered out when the Warrior had to make way to Prairie du Chien to refuel, but it returned the next morning to find the entirety of Atkinson's army pouring fire into the helpless Indians from the bluffs above the Mississippi's eastern shore. Approximately a quarter of Black Hawk's remaining followers perished in this so-called Battle of Bad Axe. Most of those who fell were women and children. Those who managed to swim to the western shore soon discovered that they had leapt from the frying pan into the fire, as their Dakota enemies lay in wait and killed as many as 200 more. The Black Hawk War was essentially over. But the colonization of the Old Northwest by the United States had merely entered a new phase. However ineptly landed by volunteers and regulars alike, the military hammer blows of the Black Hawk War broke the last vestiges of militant Indian resistance in Illinois and what was about to become the territory of Wisconsin. The tide of white settlement afterward came on fast and strong. In 1830, the non-Indian population of Illinois and the Wisconsin part of Michigan Territory were 157,000 and 3,600 respectively. 10 years later, Illinois had almost 500,000 citizens, while the population of Wisconsin increased nearly tenfold, a demographic feat replicated in the ensuing decade. Made a state in 1848, Wisconsin boasted more than 305 citizens 2 years later. A series of post-war removal treaties, meanwhile, pushed the native inhabitants aside, while others moved west or north of their own accord. Until the Civil War era, bands of so-called strolling Indians continued to try to eke out an existence in their old neighborhoods, despite the fact that they had no legal claim to the lands there anymore. And the anti-India paranoia brought about by the Great Sioux War of 1862, the Dakota Uprising, so-called, of that year, ended any kind of tolerance that the Anglo settlers of this state had for so-called strolling Indians. Forced to live on reservations or in the shadows, Wisconsin's Indians persevered while attitudes about them gradually changed over time. Today, more than 2 million American Indians live in the states that border the western Great Lakes. And the war's greatest hero is none other than Black Hawk. Americans are less familiar with the hero of that day, Henry Dodge, who parlayed his wartime service into appointment as the first and fourth governors of Wisconsin Territory and election as the state's first senator in 1848. Lincoln, meanwhile, lost his 1832 bid for the Illinois House, but won it in 1834. He went on to bigger things. But there were no laurels had, then or now, for the officers of the regular army, who found neither glory nor honor in hounding and slaughtering Black Hawk's followers. The Army's institutional memory of the war was best summarized by Colonel Zachary Taylor, yet another future president involved in this conflict, who called it a tissue of blunders miserably managed from start to finish. Now, I hope that you know something you did not know before about the Black Hawk War, to include why perhaps some Americans are inclined to forget about it. Thank you. Real quick, before we go to questions, I should also add, if you want to know yet even more, here are 3 books by 3 academics who have made their careers in Wisconsin: Carrie Trask, Patrick Young, and myself. Each of these books is really good and really quite different. If you want sort of a riveting account that almost borders on in terms of a read like fiction, Carrie Trask's book is very well written in that regard. If you want a comprehensive yet concise narrative of the war, a campaign history, I would read the middle one. And if you want to understand the phenomenon that I addressed in the talk today, the topic of my book are those Indian allies that work with the United States instead of allying with Black Hawk. I'm a very poor capitalist, otherwise I would have brought a box of those books along with me today, but I have none of them, but they're very easy to find on Amazon or elsewhere. So,
Or probably could talk to a local bookstore and might be able to get them for you as well. Thank you, John, so very much. At this time, we have time for a few questions. So I will go around with the microphone, and here's the first one. Please use the microphone for your question.
Could you tell me what the Ojibwe played in this? Were they too far north?
no, so they don't play much of a direct role in the conflict, but there's a complication here. So I mentioned overlapping alliances and so forth.
Okay.
One of the Ojibwa's most their nemesis, if you will, their principal animosity is against those same Dakotas. And where this gets complicated is the Menominees are sort of, the Potawatomis are formally part of the Three Fires. To call it a confederation, I think, is to overstate the extent of the alliance. But you have, with the Ojibwa, the Potawatomi, and the Odawa, the Three Fires tribes, and the Menominees are regarded as cousins to this alliance. And so you've got crucial members of the pro-U.S. side in the Menominees and the Potawatomis, who are also generally aligned with the Ojibwas, who are mortal enemies of the Dakotas. But for the most part, they're not involved in this conflict.
I have one more question. What's a battle between the Dakotas and the Ojibways on Strawberry Island years ago?
I'm sorry, so what about the battle?
Was there a battle?
Yes, there have been many battles between. There were a lot of battles. This is one of those simmering conflicts that I can't tell you exactly when it goes away. I don't know when the last battle would have been, but the St. Croix River Valley is essentially throughout this era a demilitarized zone, which is one of those odd oxymoronical kind of terms, which is to say it's demilitarized because any military asset that goes into that river valley is going to be targeted by the enemy. So there are historical and proto-historical accounts of many of these battles. I'm not familiar with that particular engagement, though, that you're talking about.
Okay, back over here. I'm coming, Barb.
Thank you for coming, and I have a question regarding were there native conflicts between tribes in the Fox Valley that occurred because of that push to get them all there?
So in the Fox Valley, yes, there are a number so when I say proto-historical, what I mean by that is the historical evidence is secondhand because there are oral traditions, but the oral traditions aren't quite that old. So there's no documentary evidence of it, but early settlers, missionaries, traders, etc., hear about these things from the Indians, and it gets written down, and so there's something historical about it. But there are a great many of conflicts in that region between Ho-Chunks and their neighbors, and then also, if I'm not mistaken, I haven't revisited this in quite some time, I do think some of the campaigns of the Fox Wars are waged there, because at one point, the Meskwakis make their way, after leaving principally the Detroit area, I think they make their way back up toward Green Bay, which is where they do ally more closely with the Saukes before being pushed westward. There are some of these accounts of these battles are in the Wisconsin-Historical collections, which are probably many of you know now all digitized and all available online. I wish they would have done that about 5 years previously, because while I was working on my book, I think I photocopied every page of some 20 volumes and got back to find that they were all digitized a year later or something. But
Do we have any other questions? Okay, just a moment.
I've got a real easy one on your right panel. I assume well, I won't assume anything. The two divisions of the road is obviously dividing some different troops. Who are they?
Oh, so on that piece of artwork, which I've used elsewhere, that's depicting the Great Treaty at Prairie du Chien in 1825, and this is one of those efforts that the United States makes in order to try to convince all of the Indians to set aside their animosities and just get along for a new stable colonial regime superintended by the United States. And what you have there on the right-hand side are, let me actually just go back to where I have this in a bigger slide. What you have there on the right-hand side are U.S. Army regulars. And the U.S. Army regulars are showing, some of the pomp and circumstance that distinguishes them from the volunteer or militia forces. And originally, when the U.S. moves into this region in force, beginning in about 1816, they do things like this, and they come in with cannons and they build the forts in order to awe the Indians. And so this is one of the reasons why Black Hawk is a little suspicious of American intentions, offering a treaty of peace and friendship, but they come in with this display of martial force. And the Americans are trying to awe the Indians with displays of martial might. And it kind of works, but not in the way that the Americans might have originally expected. And that same Edmund Gaines, who I mentioned earlier, eventually writes that these displays, instead of making the Indians fearful of the United States, he said it appeals to their chivalric spirit. In other words, you have two societies, both of which venerate warriors, both of which venerate accomplishments in war, and this to them is communication at a valence that they understand. They get this. They can look at that and say, oh, you're warriors like us. You elevate to positions of authority people who are good in war like us. And by the way, you also do have some manifest military capability, and you're offering to be my ally. I'll take that deal. I'd rather be behind that cannon than in front of it. And so these displays actually, they do work, but not in the way that necessarily they were originally intended. So meanwhile, on the other side, these are all of the, obviously the assembled headmen from the various tribes of the region that were summoned to the talk.
Time for another question? Yeah.
Okay. You told us that you were from Wisconsin. I would like you to comment on how you became interested in the topic of your studies.
If I should, I'll be completely candid and say it was a lack of imagination, because I was a West Point cadet and I had to write a senior thesis, and I went with what was familiar to me rather than cast a wide net and go find something brand new. I grew up very near Whitewater, and local legend has it that Lincoln lost a watch somewhere very near where I grew up. He had his horse stolen at Fort Atkinson and so forth. So this was something I probably didn't pay that much attention to while I was growing up in Wisconsin and going to Palmyra Eagle High School. But then when I had to write a senior thesis, I was interested in this region, wanted to know more about the conflict. And so I settled on the Black Hawk War, and I wrote a senior thesis on the Black Hawk War. And then the Army was kind enough to send me to graduate school, and I had to figure out what I was going to write a master's thesis on. And I went back to the well, and that's how I ended up focusing on this. But it's grown into a genuine and deep interest. And the book that I'm working on right now is actually fairly closely related. I'm writing a military history of Indian rule of the southeastern tribes, the so-called 5 civilized tribes.
To the best of my recollection, Jefferson Davis was stationed in Wisconsin in the early 1800s. Was he involved in the Black Hawk Wars?
Not really. So this is one of those points of some contention, because Jefferson Davis will later write something or say something that makes it seem as though he's claiming to have been there. He was in fact stationed, and I don't remember which regiment he was assigned to, but his actual billet, his position was there, but he was away on detached duty or leave or something else, and he doesn't actually get back in theater until the very end. So if you're looking at all the primary documents on the war, Jefferson Davis's name appears here and there because he's there at the very end when they have hundreds and hundreds of basically POWs, and they're questioning them and they're processing them, and he's back in theater for that, but he's not there for the actual war. It's only a very small minority of people who mobilized for this conflict that really see anything that deserves the word combat. So the massacre at Bad Axe is exactly that, and so you've got a bunch of people firing into an unarmed mass of humanity beyond anything else. I don't think I would call that combat. So outside of the Battle of Wisconsin Heights and the handful of little engagements, so after the Battle of Stillman's Run, Black Hawk's followers, in fact, do go on the war path. I mean, the Americans have provoked them to war, so they scatter across the northern Illinois, southern Michigan territory and attack travelers and a number of little outposts and things like that. The Battle of Pecatonica, I suppose, maybe deserves the term battle. Very, very few people that were actually in this war can claim to have seen real combat in any event. Lincoln, in fact, will later make fun of his own military experience or diminish his own military experience when he's speaking against Lewis Cass, who is a Democratic contender for a presidential nomination, and he's playing up his bona fides as a veteran of the War of 1812. And Lincoln gives a speech in Washington where he says, yeah, he's a veteran of the War of 1812 like I'm a veteran of the Black Hawk War. I didn't see any Indians, but I fought many a bloody battle with mosquitoes. And I did not bend the barrel of my musket in frustration, because I think what Cass said, after the surrender of Detroit without a fight, apparently Cass was so frustrated he bent his musket over his knee, and that was part of the campaign lore. Lincoln said something like that, I never bent the barrel of my musket in frustration, I did not break my sword over my knee in frustration, but I did accidentally bend my musket barrel against a tree or something like that. So Abraham Lincoln, who was there, never claims to really have military experience as a consequence of this conflict.
Let's give another round of applause to John. Thank you so very much.
Thank you.